Hi, I'm Michael Soper from actually from the Housing Finance Commission, and I'm delighted to introduce our next presenters for the Will Your Affordable Properties Live Long and Prosper in Spite of COVID session. Um, we have Karen Ventrice
Good
from
afternoon.
CMS. She is their wonderful affordable housing trainer and has been known to be seen on YouTube in some wonderful things, a little program called Karen's Corner. And you should check that out. Very stylized and nice. Um, Second of all, we have Shkëlqim Kelmendi, and hopefully I got the name right.
Hey, Michael, it's actually Shkëlqim Kelmendi, but it's great to be here, everyone.
Shkëlqim. You'll always remember him after this because he's the wonderful executive director of Housing Connector, and he'll tell you all about that. And I think you will be impressed. A lot of you have not heard of that before because that's been kind of a King County, maybe, Puget Sound kind of thing, but, maybe it will be seen in other places. And we have the wonderful and famous Thomas Stagg, who's appeared on many a session, and he's going to talk to us about income and rent limits and their future, what's happened to them. And the whole session is really about COVID, sort of, but it's how you survive and prosper.
Yeah,
So,
good afternoon. Thanks, Michael. Instead of calling it Karen's Corner, we call it Thomas Stagg's Sleepy Time because I'm going to put you to sleep later.
oh, but he won't because this is about your money. Yes, because this is an asset management session that has something for everyone, and it's going to change every 20 minutes, but everything's very relevant. So let's start out with Karen talking about MOR inspections.
Thank you, Michael. So as Michael said, I am Karen Ventrice. I am the Affordable Housing Trainer for the Department of CMS, and that department is within the Bremerton Housing Authority with Bremerton, Washington. So today I will be discussing how CMS has been performing MORs, the management occupancy reviews, during this COVID-19 pandemic, what has changed with the management occupancy reviews because of the pandemic, and then I'll also touch on some special funding that is available for owners and management agents for their COVID-19 related expenses. So how did we perform MORs during the pandemic? Well, unfortunately, when the pandemic first hit last year in March of 2020 and everything shut down, MORs essentially stopped. HUD had come out and provided guidance that we cease performing the reviews, so we did. So now here on the screen, I'm also showing Nebraska and Utah, and we do perform management occupancy reviews in those states as well as Washington State. And I wanted to show them primarily for comparative purposes because it is kind of interesting to see how COVID was different in the different states. For Nebraska, MORs were only shut down for April and May of 2020. So we were able to resume our MORs in June of 2020 since the state and the areas we were doing those reviews hit their COVID numbers that we needed to see. The cases weren't so high there. Washington and Utah, we had to wait till July of 2020 to begin resuming MORs there to meet that threshold of those COVID cases coming down. Now, when specialists go out to a property, we do follow all the health and safety protocols. So they are required to wear a mask, regardless of their vaccination status, and they are required to carry hand sanitizer with them at all times. If a property makes a request for them to also wear gloves or something else, we would definitely comply with that request. Usually when we go out, we try to request a separate office or a room to do our tenant file reviews, just to be able to maintain that 6-foot social distancing. Now, if a property reported a COVID case prior to their management occupancy review. So we usually give properties about a 2-week notice period of an upcoming MOR at their property. So if they had, gotten in touch with us and let us know that they had an outbreak, or, they've been experiencing a lot of COVID cases, we would essentially just, kind of follow up with the owner agent, and we would typically reschedule that MOR for the following month. Now, Utah has been our hardest hit state. We actually had to cease MORs in January earlier this year because their COVID cases had peaked really high numbers. So as you can see, this is the amount of MORs we've performed since we restarted in July for all 3 states. Oops. And with COVID-19, some things have really changed with the MOR process. So annual unit inspections at the property. So during COVID-19, HUD would not waive the requirement for annual unit inspections. However, they would allow the owner agent to determine any needed repairs or replacements in the tenant's unit via telephone, or they could do like a virtual type inspection. Entering units during MORs and then following up on any REAC items. So since MORs have resumed last year, July 2020 for all states, we still weren't entering any tenant units. So if there were REAC items that the compliance specialist needed to follow up on, the compliance specialist could essentially accept work orders from the owner agent if the owner agent was able to supply those, or we would contact the tenant ourselves via telephone or email to ensure that those items, those repairs or replacements were mitigated. Now, this guidance did just expire on this past Friday, October 1st, 2021. So now going forward, any MORs that our compliance specialists go on, they will be entering those tenant units. HUD did not extend that guidance. Now, specialists are able to still perform any opening or exit interviews virtually. So some properties that we have are super small, so social distancing can't really be obtained. And so for those, we would offer the option to do it via telephone, or sometimes we do it, via FaceTime or a Zoom call with the owner agent for those interview questions. Now, one of the cool things that came out of the pandemic, I personally think, is the ability for the owner agent to submit their tenant file reviews to us electronically. Now, they can submit them electronically so long as they follow that Housing Notice 2020-04. We did have one property in Washington that submitted their whole entire tenant file review electronically, and it went flawlessly. It was so fantastic. It was actually a bit of a larger property. We had to do 12 files, and our compliance specialists were able to whip that out easy peasy. Now, even though they can submit electronically, we do still have to do a physical walkthrough of the property. So we do still have to go to the property to look and do that walkthrough with the owner agent. But again, they can submit electronically, and we can do those exit interviews virtually. And then finally, last year, HUD did announce with Housing Notice 2020-8, the COVID-19 supplemental payments from the CARES Act Fund, so our CSP requests. So owner agents could request reimbursement for costs associated with preventing, preparing for, and responding to the pandemic. And properties could either request a Tier 1 or a Tier 2 request. Now, a Tier 1 request was a capped-based amount of the property size. Then they would receive additional funds if they did have a service coordinator, and or if they were set to serve an elderly community. Now, a Tier 2 request was for those bigger requests that were above the capped amount. So Tier 2 is really for the larger sums that owner agents would be requesting to be able to address those cost increases associated with responding to reported COVID outbreaks among their tenants, or even to be able to respond to those extensive community exposures that could potentially, that creates a greater threat to the health and safety of their residents within their community. So the very first round of CSPs was for expenses incurred from March of 2020 through July 31st of 2020. Now, after the first round, HUD realized they had quite a bit of money left over. So then they announced a second round late last year. And again, after the second round, they realized they still had a lot of money. So then they announced the third round, which was earlier this year. They announced the third round in April of 2021. And even after the third round, they realized they still had a lot of money. So now they've announced a fourth round. So after all three rounds, HUD had only dispersed about 40 million of the available 240 million for Section 8, Section 202, and Section 811 properties. So then this past September, it was just a couple weeks ago, September 16th, actually, HUD announced the fourth, and they're stating it's most likely going to be the final round of CSPs. And they announced that with Housing Notice 2021-05. So there is about $180 million left over that HUD has to disperse to eligible properties. The fourth round is for expenses incurred from April of 2021 through October 31st, 2021. So properties do still have time to make additional COVID-19 related expenses that can then be added to their CSP request. And with this fourth round, HUD did make some changes and additions. Now, properties still have a capped amount. So a property gets a base amount of $2,500. So that's up from previous rounds. Previous rounds, it was a base amount of $2,000. And then they get an additional $75 per assisted unit. And again, that's up from previous rounds where it was only $60 per assisted unit. And this amount is capped at $25,000. So if you do have one of those larger properties, like a 350 assisted unit property, you would be capped at that $25,000. And again, like previous rounds, if you do are an elderly community-based property, you do get that additional $1,000. And then if the property has an eligible service coordinator that has eligible service coordinator COVID-19 related expenses, the property could get an additional $1,250. And then instead of tier 1 and tier 2 requests from previous rounds, HUD has changed it to category A and category B requests. And with this, HUD has kind of outlined eligible expenses and which category they fall under. So category A is essentially mirroring a tier 1 request from previous rounds. So such things as costs associated with intensive deep cleaning, any sanitization services, buying your face masks, your gloves, your hand sanitizers. Those are all eligible category A expenses, as well as facility and equipment expenses related to maintaining social distancing. So if you bought any of those plastic barriers for your desk, the cough and sneeze barriers, that's an eligible expense. Temporary staffing or contract services. So we've had a lot of properties experience an influx of having to do interim recertifications from tenants losing their income, unfortunately, due to the pandemic. So if you've had to up your staffing or any overtime costs, that's a category A eligible expense. The only thing that they're not allowing is any hazard pay that you may pay to your employees. You cannot claim that, nor can you claim any bonuses. Now, one of the new things under category A is the inclusion of disposable HVAC filters, as well as minor equipment expenditures to improve air quality over a temporary period. So if you've been buying air filters for your HVAC system, or perhaps your property rented a window fan or a portable air purifier for the office or those high traffic common areas, those expenses can be included now in your CSP request. Now, category B, these are for your eligible capital expenses. So HVAC ventilation system infiltration upgrades. So unlike category A expenses, where it's just primarily for those disposable air filters, the category B is for any upgrades that you did to your HVAC system as a whole. Also under category B is reimbursement for any generators that are necessary to address critical medical needs. And there's a documented risk of recurring power outages that would then create a significant risk to residents if a stay-at-home order or public health directive, prevented or discouraged those temporary relocations. Typically, we see those in our elderly communities. And then the big one under category B that is new, HUD will allow CSP reimbursement for the purchase and installation of infrastructure needed to support building-wide Wi-Fi. And this could be for equipment that supports services in tenant units and or common areas. Now, and these are just a few of the eligible items. So I encourage you to read Housing Notice 2021-05 for more information, including the financial needs requirements and the documentation requirements. We also do have a video that goes in depth into the Housing Notice on the CMS website for your viewing. And like I mentioned, this round is for expenses incurred through October 31st, 2021. So you do still have a couple of weeks to make those eligible expenses. And then requests are due November 19th, 2021. Now, HUD has still not yet released the updated CSP form for owner agents to fill out. But again, you can always check the CMS website and we will always have those updates for you. And then just kind of a visual for all three rounds so far, that funds that were received in our portfolio. So far we've had 66 properties submit requests for CSPs, and a total of 128,561 was approved and paid to properties to assist with their COVID-19 related costs. So I really am hoping and encouraging folks to apply for this money. Like I said, there's $180 million still left in this bank for us to get at. Really take advantage of getting your portion of that CSP pie. And so with that, I thank you so much for your time. If you have any questions or would like more information regarding the CSPs, you can give me a call, email me. My information is here on the screen for you, and I would be more than happy to assist. So thank you.
Well, I don't see any questions in the chat. We'll give you a little bit more time if you're still formulating those questions. Remember, so anything about MOR inspections that's going on and going to continue to go on could be part of the question, or how to get some of that money, which is going to be a recurring theme in this session, because we're trying to show you the money. And so help us show you the money. Well, Chelsea says thank you. That was very informative. We love it.
Oh, great.
Thank you, Chelsea. Other things that you might be interested in, the whole kind of inspection world that's out there right now. So it looks like, from what I've read, which is a little bit, that HUD has been giving some really close directives on other programs. So like the home program and the public housing program, and have even done some extensions of time. And it seems like, from what I've read, that many of them are going to have to go back and kind of make up what hasn't been done. Okay. So for us that do tax credits and bonds, we haven't heard from the IRS, and maybe we won't. So we're going to come out with some guidance about what to do at this point on a whole bunch of things that were kind of left there for COVID. But you really kind of, I think, have to start thinking about things in a normal way as far as doing things. And so, inspections are going to start up again for all these things. And I think the first of the year and those first few months, 6 months are just going to be really, really busy. So you should try to do as much as you can to prepare for that, to kind of get the property ready as safely as you can, and really be careful with that. I haven't heard from rural development, but if they've started up again. So we're really kind of in this kind of waiting period. But so Karen, would you kind of agree with that?
Yes, very much so.
Has there been any kind of surprises in what people were going through? I know that there were maybe some states that had a worse COVID situation than others. Um, did they have to reschedule? How did that work?
Yeah, we've had a lot of rescheduling. Excuse me, like I said, in Utah, because their COVID case numbers just keep ticking up, and some in Washington as well. We've had to reschedule quite a few times. There was one particularly in Seattle that I think we rescheduled like 5 different times because they just kept having COVID outbreaks at their property.
So this could potentially happen, especially maybe some of the rural areas that aren't seeing the vaccination rates increase as much as others. Um, and so I would imagine, so this is really good for the funders who meet regularly every quarter to get together and just sort of know as they try to plan these things. For us at the commission, we're using inspection services to do things. And so it's always good to know, what you've been experiencing, because we probably will have to know that too. So any more questions out there? I don't see any right now. Um, and but Karen, did you have any other parting words, or were there any other questions from any of the other panel members about MOR inspections or the money that's available from HUD? Well, we thought we'd give you that opportunity. So, are you ready? We'll go on.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you, everyone, for being here and being a part of this conversation. My name is Shkëlqim Kelmendi. I'm the Executive Director of Housing Connector, and I wanted to take a just slightly different approach today. I know Karen dove into really the details. I wanted to take a little bit, maybe a more 30,000 foot view about what's going on, what we're seeing, and some potential solutions that we can offer. I think we can all agree that the past 18 months have been incredibly difficult for all of us. Both housing providers and renters have been hit by really unprecedented challenges that have brought many of us to the edge of a financial cliff. However, I'm also convinced that COVID and the economic fallout has only unmasked and exacerbated an underlying problem that was there way before last year. For context, in the United States, nearly 50% of individuals are living paycheck to paycheck, and they have no assets to rely on in the event that a financial shock happens. So this housing crisis that we're experiencing and that we find ourselves, in my opinion, was inevitable. Earlier today, Alicia Mazzara mentioned that there are now about 176,000 adults here in Washington state that are behind on rent. And there's another 1.2 million households that said that they are going to have a difficult time paying just their usual expenses. So that puts in context the situation that we're dealing with. So the question now is how we respond, not just for today and for the crisis that we find ourselves, but also for the long-term sustainability to ensure that renters and property owners have the support to succeed and weather the next financial crisis, regardless of what may cause it. So what I want to share with you today is a win-win solution that we have developed at Housing Connector that not only ensures housing providers have the support to survive and prosper, but also to address one of the biggest crises that we have outside of COVID, which is our homelessness crisis. And to do that, I wanted to start by first sharing a story with you. I want you to imagine that for the past 2 years, you've been struggling to find a home. You've applied to over 20 apartments, each time optimistic that this application might be a breakthrough, only to be dealt with another denial because of your low credit score. And frankly, at some point you begin to lose hope and accept that this nightmare is the reality for you. And in our communities, this in fact is reality for thousands of individuals, because barriers such as credit score, past debt, and eviction determine whether an individual and a family has a second chance at a home. And this isn't just a Seattle or a Washington state problem. This is a problem across the US that continues to get worse. Right now, over 500,000 individuals are experiencing homelessness nationwide. And after seeing this play out over and over and over again, we decided that this can't be acceptable any longer. And so we set out to find a solution. In Q4 of 2019, we launched Housing Connector with the vision that no unit should sit vacant while there are people in need of a home. To achieve this vision, though, we decided to take a business approach and partner directly with property owners and managers to reduce those barriers and increase the access to housing for people most in need. And what we realized is this: when a unit sits vacant, it's not only a financial loss for a property, it is also a loss for our community. And what we saw is that in that proposition right there was an opportunity for us to find a solution. And so our strategy is to center property owners and managers as our primary customer. And we provide them with free referrals for their vacant units, as well as the financial safety net and support that allows them to lower those criteria and rent to families exiting homelessness. And this approach, what it does is it takes into consideration the biggest challenges facing landlords today, and it deploys solutions to address them. First, we provide landlords with free referrals to fill vacant units and increase occupancy rates. The second is we ensure that rent will be paid by providing 3 months of rent guarantee if the resident is unable to pay. And obviously, you're all familiar that that is something that's become increasingly problematic during COVID and the economic state that we find ourselves in. Third, we provide each property up to $5,000 in damages per household that moves in. So if for whatever reason your unit is damaged, you're not left holding that liability. And finally, we wanted to make sure that each resident that moves in has the support to be successful in that unit and for that property to have a thriving community. And to do so, we make sure that every household has 1 year of case management support to not only get housed, but stay stably housed. And in exchange for this financial and customer support, our property partners agreed to reduce their waivers and screening criteria related to credit score, criminal history, past eviction, and past debt, again, so more families have access to these properties. But this is just one side of the equation. On the demand side, what we see is that there's so many folks looking for housing, and it's a really fragmented process to find units. And so what we do is we partner with over 100 nonprofit service providers to ensure that case managers have access to these units for their clients. Prior to Housing Connector, case managers searched websites, they cold called landlords, they did everything they could to try to find a unit for their clients, and often submitted dozens of applications and paid fees related to that, simply hoping that their client would be approved. And this process is time and resource intensive, and frankly, often leads to no results. And the whole time that is happening, that family or that individual is still experiencing homelessness, and the trauma and stress associated with it continues to build. And we said there has to be a better way and a more effective way to do that. And that is exactly what our partners now have. Our partners now have access to a centralized marketplace where they can see real-time availabilities and they can access those units with reduced screening criteria. And it's not just any marketplace. To ensure the best possible search experience, we actually partnered with Zillow, and we've developed a platform that's built within Zillow.com, where these units can be advertised in real time, and case managers can expedite their housing search. So to put this kind of in context, just like you and I would utilize Zillow when we're searching for a home to rent, case managers now go to Zillow.com, they log into their account, and when they do so, they have access to new functionality that basically allows them to see units that aren't visible to the general population. From there, they can search for these units, and not only just based on the client's preferences. Let's say I want a 1-bedroom in federal waive for $1,400. But they can also filter these units based on the barriers that their clients have, so that when they click search, it expedites that process and makes sure that those clients are receiving units that have already agreed to accept their barriers. And this does two things. Again, it expedites the search process, but it also helps housing providers make sure that the applications they're receiving are ones that will be approved, so that you don't have to go through the whole process simply to deny somebody. And what we found is that this is now a search process that takes minutes instead of often days. And once residents move in, we don't stop there. We believe in housing first, but we also want support after housing to make sure that folks have the stability. And that's where we come in with that 2 years of additional support to ensure successful outcomes. And ultimately what we see is people not only getting housed, but also staying housed. And it's leading to outcomes that will ultimately decrease our overall homelessness population. So, this all sounds really good, but does the data suggest that this works? And what we see is that since our launch in Q4 of 2019, we have developed partnerships with over 940 properties and 105 nonprofit organizations. And we've been able to connect over 2,100 people to housing. And if we take a closer look at the people that have been housed, we see that 60% of those households are households of color. And to date, we've only had 2.5% of the households housed have had a negative move out. And that's pretty incredible. And really, it's a testament to the support that the team provides after somebody moves in to make sure that that property has the resources to create a safe and stable situation for everyone involved. This impact is promising, and what I say is amazing is that this was done through the COVID crisis and the fact that there was an eviction moratorium as well. Since last April, Housing Connector actually saw an increase of 400% in the number of properties that were joining the partnership. And the big reason for that is our commitment to finding solutions for our housing partners that ultimately result in win-win outcomes, right? Something that not only benefits the renter, but also benefits that housing provider, that leasing agent, or that property manager, so that we can ensure that there is successful outcomes. And in addition to that, we've also been able to generate over $10 million in revenue for our partners and connect our partners to different rent relief resources and navigate some of the challenges in the system over the last year. So I want to pause here and circle back to my initial point, which is this. If we are going to not just survive, but actually thrive, we have to find a better way to work together. Because if we don't, our housing and homelessness crisis is just going to get worse. And I fundamentally believe that we all want the same thing. I always say to folks, housing providers aren't in the business of evicting people, they're in the business of housing people. And when we can find that common ground and we can invest in pragmatic solutions, we amplify our impact and ultimately have better outcomes for everyone involved. So a little bit of context of what we've done there, but also because of this impact that we've made in King County, we're actually now expanding our reach, and we just launched operations in Pierce County. And starting next month, we will be officially launching operations in Denver, in Colorado. And the reason why is that we see this as a problem across the US, and this is a solution that helps housing providers and communities regardless of the situation that they're in. And we will continue to invest in that in order to be able to help as many folks as possible to address this issue. So for those of you who are housing providers, I hope you consider joining us in this movement. As mentioned, we are actively looking to scale beyond just the Puget Sound region and looking at Spokane and other areas here in Washington State. But also for others that are making policy and investment decisions, I encourage you to remember that this is not a zero-sum game. And we can do good in our community while also helping housing providers run a successful business. And ultimately, I think that's what's going to allow us to benefit and prosper regardless of the circumstances we're in. So I hope this has been helpful. I hope this is something and an example of ways that we can address problems and that we can partner together to increase the outcomes and have better results. And I appreciate your time today. So thank you so much. And I'm happy to take any questions, Michael, from you or others here today.
Well, we do have some questions. Katie's asking, is this only in King County or are other counties able to get involved?
Hey, Katie, right, it started off in King County. We are officially operational in Pierce County, as well as starting in Snohomish County as well. So that's where, and again, as I mentioned, we're also looking at Colorado now, launching here in a couple of weeks. But we do see this as a statewide solution. So we hope to expand this to Spokane and other communities in the next year.
Great. Chelsea's asking or saying that she knows some people who would benefit from this. Where would I direct them to? And the people that she's thinking of are in a rural environment.
Yeah, and I think, you know, if folks have questions, feel free to reach out. The best way to do it is send an email to info@housingconnector.com. To answer your question specifically, if they're not in the current regions that we're operating, we wouldn't be able to do much at this point. Again, our hope is that we can expand into those other communities here in the next few months and years. But if you have any specific questions or folks that are in King, Pierce, and Snohomish that could benefit from this, feel free to reach out at info@housingconnector.com to get connected. And that goes for housing providers as well who may be interested in these benefits in this partnership.
Karen asks, what are you hearing as the biggest concern from landlords and housing providers?
Yeah, Karen, that's such a good question. I think what we're hearing is, what do we do with some of the behavioral issues that come up, especially during this eviction moratorium? And I think, you know, there's a lot of potential tension that's been built up between housing providers and renters. One thing we've done as a team is to try to respond to that concern is we've actually started a conflict intervention service and a mediation service, so that if a renter and a landlord or property manager are in a situation where they're not seeing eye to eye, instead of letting that issue escalate, they can actually contact us and we can step in with additional support to try to mediate and de-escalate the issue. But I would say that's probably the biggest issue. You know, often, yes, there's financial concerns, but what do we do with those behavioral violations that are maybe causing challenges for other community members as well?
Well, I noticed in your presentation, there was only 3 evictions.
Yeah, and the beautiful thing about that, Michael, is, again, my big belief in our model is that if we have early interventions, we can step in and address them way before they get to the eviction point. I don't think it is feasible. I don't think it's right to wait for somebody to have an eviction notice for us to activate resources to help. Frankly, at that point, it's too late. And the way we do that, Michael, is we actually, with all of our property partners, we connect with them every single month, about the 6th of the month, and say, you know, for example, hey, Michael, we know that these residents from Housing Connector are living in your building. Let us know if you need any support, whether it's financial or there's a behavioral lease violation, so we can step in now and address that issue before it gets out of hand. And Michael, what we've seen is by being able to be proactive in that process, we can address a lot of these concerns faster and cheaper than by waiting until they, you know, things have escalated to an eviction notice or something of that nature. And oftentimes that's meant negotiating a mutual termination to avoid that eviction, or helping that individual or that household relocate to another unit that might be a better fit. But ultimately, it's a win-win outcome for both the renter and the property manager.
Well, not to give away all the secrets, but are there any like COVID things that you found, programs or money pots that are there from the various acts that are out there that maybe people have not noticed? Maybe the asset manager, the property manager, the owner hasn't noticed?
You know, I don't think I can probably give you more advice or more suggestions than folks probably already have. I know this is something that's top of mind for a lot of asset managers. Where I would say, Michael, is probably the pain point at times is how quickly that money's been distributed. And this is where, just again, to be transparent, I hope our community can work closer with housing providers in the future to distribute funding and find ways that we can get money out the door and into the ledgers of those folks that need it. But I don't have any secrets there. I think it's more of how do we just work better, both with the government as well as the housing providers, to better connect the resources with the folks that need it at the right time.
So what types of housing have you had a lot of experience with? Have you done things for seniors or farm workers or any of the groups that you can think of?
Yeah, I mean, I would say we worked a lot with throughout the spectrum. Maybe not farm workers directly, as you pointed that one out. That's probably one that we have not. But we've worked with a lot with seniors, with veterans, with youth, significantly with families. About 55% of the households we've housed are families with a minor under the age of 18. And what we see is across the board, there's a need for housing for individuals that might have a barrier. And Michael, one of the things we say is, we don't think that credit scores should define character when folks are going through the process. And I think it's been eye-opening the number of families and individuals that may be experiencing homelessness just because of a credit score or because of a past debt that they have. And really, our goal is to make sure that those individuals and families can access a home and have the bridge and support to be stably housed, so they don't fall back into homelessness because of one setback.
Are there any of the presenters that have a question for Shelton? No? So great. And we can continue to have questions there. We're going to move on to Thomas, who has a lot to say about what's our future and the money.
Right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Michael, for putting this together. That was really fascinating what we've heard so far today. I'm really interested in this Housing Connect, so I'm going to definitely look some more into that. But if you know me, I love to talk about income limits. I get really excited. I was joking when it was Thomas sleepy time because I get a little over animated when I talk about income limits. But let's jump in here and just start by laying a little kind of field work here to see where we were at. Whoa, a little delayed clicking. I apologize. You got a little sneak peek there. So let's kind of look at what's happened with income limits last year to kind of lay the groundwork for what we see coming in the future. If we kind of focus on the country, overall, a lot of increases. 2/3 of the country is up, about 1/3 of the country had decreases. So this is kind of typical of what we were seeing kind of in the early teens, 2013, 2014, 2015, a little slower than last year. But then we look at Washington State, we see that we're basically almost all green except for a couple little pockets. And I kept getting this question over and over this summer, so I thought I'd address it here, is how in the world did income limits go down in King County? Everything I know about King County tells me income limits should be going up. And the reason why it went down is first we have to understand that HUD, when they're calculating income limits, they have these adjustments that they apply. And I pulled this slide in from this presentation we do where you look at all these adjustments, but there's this adjustment called a high housing cost adjustment. And basically what it says, whoa, rent is so expensive here that more people need assistance. So HUD will actually artificially inflate the income limit in these areas. So King County is such an area, or was, I should say. King County, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Miami, places like that have really high rents compared to income limits get this artificial boost because of fair market rents. But what happened is, if we look at these fair market rents from 2020 to 2021, there was this huge drop in fair market rents. And again, you're probably wondering and saying, how in the world did fair market rents go down year over year? And there's a long backstory to this, but basically it has to do with how HUD calculates fair market rents. And historically, King County has been subject to a independent rent study, if you will. They call it a fair market rent reevaluation. And in 2021, there was no reevaluation done, and we just used the HUD limits or the HUD calculation. So going from this self-study to this HUD calculation is what caused this big decrease in fair market rents. And so when we went and did that fair market rent calculation to figure out what our income limit would be, we actually ended up having a big decrease. But luckily, AMI was increasing at the same time. So it kind of swooped in and kind of leveled the playing field a little bit here. So you'll see with this high housing cost adjustment, HUD does this calculation every year for every area. And in 2020, King County was a high housing cost area. And so our limits were based off of fair market rents, basically. And then in 2021, those fair market rents decreased And now it dropped below the AMI level. So now we're in AMI limit. And so you might be sitting there saying, that's really weird. AMIs went up, but income limits still went down. And it's because of this interplay. And that probably was interesting to the 5 of you who already emailed me about this, but I thought I'd just get that out to the larger group. But anyways, I think what we want to shift to now is talk about, well, what does the future hold? And to understand what the future holds, we have to understand how HUD calculates area median incomes. So we have this awesome, this is my favorite map that we ever produced. It's the change in area median income. I love the deep colors, the textures you look across the country, but let's talk about how HUD actually calculates this, because this will give us the answer to a couple of questions. Number one, first question is, when is this pandemic going to impact income limits? Has it already happened with 2021 limits? I showed you that they were a little bit slower than they were historically. Is it going to hit us in 2022 or sometime else? And how big of an impact is it going to be? So to do this, we have to understand how HUD calculates area median income. So what they do, they use this, what's called the American Community Survey data, ACS data. And that ACS data is always from 3 years prior to the HUD year. So for 2020 income limits, we're using 3-year-old ACS data. So 2017 ACS data, American Community Survey income data. And then you say, well, that's 3 years old. We somehow have to trend that from that data year to the income limit year. And they use this CPI factor to do that. What's interesting is that everybody in the country uses the same CPI factor. There's no local adjustment for this. So your ACS data is local, but your trend factor is the same trend factor for everybody. And so we see that for 2021 this year, we're using 2018 American Community Survey data. And then come out here to 2023, we're going to be using 2020 ACS data. And so if you know anything about 2020, there's a lot of impact to incomes. And so that 2020 data won't really be picked up in income limits till 2023. So let's take a little bit more look at this. But we do pick up a little bit of this early adjustment in this CPI factor. And so 2021 is really interesting because although that happened kind of in April, I was saying the tail end of the pandemic, but now it looks like it's kind of the middle of the pandemic. Even though these 2021 income limits came out mid-pandemic, they weren't really too impacted by the pandemic other than a little bit with the 2021 CPI, because 2018 data was pre-pandemic, 2018 CPI was pre-pandemic. So it's just really the CPI estimate that impacted this. So let's take a look at what that means here. So let's look at this example. For example, we're going to use national median income as kind of our number that we're benchmarking against. So we have this for 17, 18, and 19 for the ACS data. And so for our example, we'll come here, we're going to pull 2018 up here and take a little closer look at 2018, which again, 2018 ACS data is what drove 2021. And this will give you the first look at how COVID impacted this. So again, COVID didn't have any impact on the ACS data, but it did have an impact on the CPI. So when we first ran our calculations, so we do these calculations and we, as we'll talk about more later, we actually do these calculations of this forward looking. And so, back when the pandemic started, or pre-pandemic in January of 2020, we published our estimates of 2021 income limits. And our initial estimate was $81,000 because that's what the CPI at the time was telling us. But then guess what? COVID hit shortly thereafter, and the CPI estimate dropped by a lot. And suddenly from going from a 3% increase over the prior year, dropped all the way down to just barely 1% increase. But thankfully, by the time that the actual CPI that HUD uses came out, it had rallied back up a little bit. And so we end up with 2021, about almost a 2% increase over the prior year. And so we see how COVID already kind of impacted 2021 limits because of this CPI adjustment. So how's COVID going to impact 2022 limits? And so we see here that COVID is likely going to have a very little impact on 2022 limits. In fact, this is the first year hearing this. 2022 is going to be a very, very robust income limit growth year. We look at what's been happening with the CPI projections. When we looked at this in February of this year, our CPI growth rate was about 1.04, 1.05. And so we're already estimating a 6% increase over 2021. And now a lot of you are probably scratching your head and saying, how is that possible? How are we having this huge increase when we're still in the middle of this pandemic. But then we look, it even got rosier in July. This estimate of CPI came out and it was even higher. Now you have to remember this July estimate was kind of pre-Delta variant. And so there's some more that we're going to unpack there on a second. But based on the data we have now, if HUD was calculating this limit today, they'd be publishing a national median income that was almost 8% over 2021. Now, we don't know what's going to happen with their CPI estimate here that HUD will actually use. It'll come out in January, February next year. And so this number could trend down or maybe trend up depending on what's happening with CPI. But kind of the good news here is because if we come over to the left-hand side of your screen here and you look and say, because the underlying ACS data from 17 to 18 grew by almost 6%, 2022 that's based on that is projected to have this huge growth as well. And so the concern is everybody's going to come out of 2022, see these limits growing by 7% and say, oh my goodness, the pandemic is over, income limits are safe. But what's going to happen here in 2023? Unfortunately, 2023 is when 2020 ACS data is finally going to hit us. And so all this data that's being collected during 2020 related to income limits is now going to come in and hit us in 2023. And so what does that mean? If we hold ACS flat from 18 to 19, we say, I'm sorry, from 19 to 20, we say, hey, pandemic didn't really push down incomes. And maybe this is in your area, it didn't really push them down. Because that CPI factor right now, you actually would have about a 1% increase in income limits if the pandemic only kept income limits flat in your area. But we think that likely pandemic's going to maybe have a negative impact on median income. And so if it does have an impact on this ACS data, you could see that, if that ACS data from 2020 is 5% lower than 2019, that's going to translate into a 2022 limit that's 5% lower than what we had, 2023 limit that's 5% lower than what we had in 2019. If incomes actually fell off the cliff here and had a 10% decrease, then we'd say that median income would fall by almost 10%. Now, of course, that's going to be capped at 5% because, or floored, I should say, because HUD floors decreases at 5%. So I know there's a lot of numbers on this slide, so let's just take a step back and talk a little bit more about this. So 2023, depending on what happens with this ACS information, could be a year that finally we feel this COVID impact to income limits and we start to see a decrease. And it's a little bit weird, right? Because it's so far removed from COVID, because these 2023 limits will come out in April of 2023. Knock on wood, hopefully we're done talking about COVID at that point. But the problem is that if these decreases materialize then, you need to know about that now so you're planning accordingly. And also we need to know about this so we're talking to the right people to maybe get some sort of industry safe harbor here so we don't have this big decrease. But if that's not bad enough news, there's even more uncertainty around 2020 because the Census Bureau last month announced that they didn't receive enough responses to the 2021 year ACS that they will not be publishing a 2021 year ACS for 2020. Now, that's potentially bad news because we use that 1 year ACS for various information. So it's used for fair market rents, income limits, and other HUD data. And so if we don't receive this 1 year ACS, likely we'll use a 5 year ACS. Now, it's a little bit of a give and take here on this 5 year ACS because when we talk about a 1 year ACS, they look only at responses during that year and find the median income. And now, again, we're looking at the median. It's not the average, it's the median. And so you're taking that midpoint, but over time, income limits have increased, right? And so on a 5 year ACS, they don't weight the responses at all. They take the median of all responses during that 5 year period. And so what does that mean is when we come out and we're doing this as part of this working group we have to address these income limit issues, we looked at all 330 MSAs from 2016 to 2019, and we compared the 5 year ACS to the 1 year ACS. And in 92% of the areas, the 1 year is greater than the 5 year. And that difference is right about 3.71%. So if we look at historically, switching from a 1 year ACS to a 5 year ACS would have resulted in about 3.71% lower income and rent limit. And that's right. That's bad news across the board if suddenly we're going to slow this down by 3.71%. But what's interesting about that is we don't know yet how 2020 will factor into this 5-year, because likely for a lot of areas, 2020 is going to be lower than 2019. So maybe that 3.71 is a little bit offset by that, but it's still an issue. And so what we're doing is we're kind of trying to get ahead of this and figure out, A, how big of an impact this lack of data is going to have, B, what sort of impact that's going to have on income limits, so that if, and maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here. So the ACS has said, hey, we won't release the 1 year, but we'll release the 5-year hopefully in December. And so in December, we're going to get all this data about the 5-year and start crunching what we think our estimates will be for 2023. And if we see that across the board, there are some decreases, that's when we need to act to try and get Congress or HUD to change how we do the calculation for this year to account for this bad data, similar to what we did in 2008 with Harris Special or something like that to address this income issue. So long story short, kind of for just breaking this all down, I think the takeaway is that 2022 is likely going to be a really big increase in income and rent limits. 2023 could potentially fall off the cliff for two reasons. One, that's when all the COVID data is going to start flowing into our limits. And two, we won't have a 1 year estimate to use. We have to use this 5-year that's historically been slower. If you're interested in participating in this working group, send me an email. We're crunching numbers. We just did this for 16 to 19. We're going back now and looking at this from 08 to 2012 to see how kind of the recession impacted the difference between 5-year and 1 year. And then December, when we have the data, we're going to really dig into it. Okay, so I have one more thing that I want to talk about here. I know I think I'm getting close to the end of my allotted time, but the final thing is Michael asked me about this last night, and this is kind of important, I think, to two discussions. Is the minimum wage in King County is going up by, I think it was 5% from what you sent, but it's important to understand that when we're looking at median income, it is a median. And so that minimum wage impact is felt differently in different markets. The top market is King County. Our median income is right around $100,000. So this increase in minimum wage is likely, so this is a 2-person household with both people working at minimum wage, that would be a salary of $62,400. That likely is not going to have a lot of pressure on that median income level that's $100,000. There will be some upward pressure, right? As minimum wage goes up, the jobs right above minimum wage go up, and the jobs right above that go up, and so forth. But it's interesting to kind of understand how far up that's going to push it. But if we had an area that you had median income of $70,000, now minimum wage is bumping up against that median income, you're going to have a much bigger impact in median income in those areas. So likely this increase in minimum wage probably won't impact our median income in King County. In other markets, it would have a huge impact. And the other interesting thing about median is that's that same discussion we're looking at next year with this ACS data, how that's going to impact different markets differently, right? So if you think about King County, people earning around $100,000 a year were probably a lot less impacted by COVID than those people who are earning around $30,000, $40,000, or $50,000 a year. And so if everybody below $100,000, suddenly their income went to zero, that wouldn't change our median because they're already below the median. And so it's going to be interesting to see how all these interplay with income limits coming in 2020. I will plug a podcast I did with Mike Novogradac, Tax Ret Tuesday podcast. We get into a lot of the nitty gritties here about how all these changing dynamics might impact median income. If this is something you geek out on like me, I'd strongly suggest you check that out. And then I will just, here mention quickly that we do sell these estimates. So if you're interested in what 2023 or 2022 is going to look like for your area, 2022 now, 2023 probably in December, you can come online and you can purchase this estimate. It's fairly accurate because we use the same sources as HUD, but there is obviously it's never 100% correct. So that was the end of my canned material. I'm happy to take questions. Typically, I find that a lot of people's questions are kind of too, that people often follow up with me offline with more questions. So definitely feel free to do that, or we can jump into them here as well.
Well, we don't have any questions yet, but I was going to maybe try to ask a few questions. So your calculator program, so we often say, because we have to crunch the numbers when the new income and rent limits come out. And so we often say, hey, go look at Novogradac's, because often you're able to do it quicker than we are, even though you got the whole country to do. So just something to consider for people. And also
And
your
Michael, I just want to mention that calculator is free, will always be free. You can come in and look up limits for any county in the country, different programs, different set-asides that you can put in. That will always be free. So definitely come there and play around with that.
But one of your calculators, or maybe it's the same one, I guess they can put in the different programs that they're working with. And some of those have more programs than WBARS is participating in. So that could be really helpful, so that they don't miss something and overcharge for,
Yeah, we have other programs. You can also customize it if you have a regulatory agreement that makes you do it on actual number of people in the unit. For example, you come down and say, I have 5 people in a 2-bedroom. What's my rent limit based on that? So there's all kinds of fun things you can do on that calculator.
Right. And so, is there anything people can do to, I don't know, influence the census board or whatever on these things? Or is it best to just sort of let it play out?
No, I don't think it's best to let play. I think what's going to happen is, come January, we're going to have crunched all this data, and we're going to see how big of an impact it is. And we're working with, a lot of the large institutional investors, a lot of the large developers, to get a coalition together. So once we have information, we can either petition HUD to say, hey, you can't switch to the 5-year. That's going to have this huge negative impact on us. You have to use 1 year. And if HUD doesn't kind of listen and acquiesce and come up with some sort of alternative, then we have to go to congressional and say, hey, as part of this Credit Improvement Act or whatever it may be, whatever vehicle it is, we need something similar to HERA to keep all these projects from not being able to be financially feasible. Because the problem is, if we go down by 10% because of this, that's not just down 10% for 1 year. And existing projects, yeah, maybe you're held harmless, but you're going to be flat until you climb back out of that hole. So you could be looking at flat rents for 6-7 years, and that is catastrophic to a project, because your limits are flat, but your utility allowances are increasing. That's eating into your net rent, and your expenses are never flat, right? Utility costs increase every year, and so that's it's a very big issue that we're kind of on the forefront now. And without going into too much detail, we had a similar thing happen back in 2005-ish, where HUD changed area definitions, and it caused all these things to be flat for a long time. And that's what caused HERA. A lot of people think HERA was part of that economic slowdown. It was kind of twofold. But on that case, we weren't ahead of it. And HUD snuck up on us, and the industry had to wait 5 years to get this technical correction. We're trying to get way ahead of it this time, so that when it does happen, we can, we already have a plan in place for this. And that's why it's so important that we're talking about it now, even though those limits aren't going to be published for 18 months. We want to be lobbying for 18 months to get the right answer.
So if they want to do more or be a part of it, then they should contact you.
Reach out to us. We're definitely going to have blogs on it as well. The working group is actually a paid working group to kind of cover the time crunching all this data and sharing it. But all the data done by the working group is eventually going to be shared publicly. So even if you just want to follow along, that's great too. If you want to help underwrite the time, that's awesome. But that's not what this session's about. It's about getting the information out there so that we are aware of it. And if you're underwriting things for 2023, don't think it's going to be another big uptick year. It's probably going to be a decrease or a flat year.
Right. So different rules for different programs. So, there's not more than just one income limit type, as we are painfully aware. So keep track of that. And also in the e-news that's coming out, for those of you that subscribe to that, we'll be talking about the minimum wage increases, which are starting to be known. Because what do we have? 3 now minimum wages in different parts of the state? And of course, the state minimum wage. And you will be amazed at how much it went up. Oh my gosh. It's going up in January. And if you're doing certifications, guess what? You need to know what that number is once you know it. So once you know it, you got to use it for the future. So were there any questions from the other panelists for Thomas?
Michael, we're at time. We've got our Friends of Housing that's about to begin in about 1 minute.
Oh, okay. Well, we appreciate you all tuning in. And remember, we'll be repeated, I think, in other ways and on YouTube. We thank you to all the presenters. We really appreciate it. And thank you so much. See you soon.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.